Beati Hispani, quibus vivere, bibere est. When talking about Betacism, tradition dictates that I quote this old Roman joke, which seems to make fun of Latin speakers in the province of Hispania and how they pronounce their B's and their V's. The quote, which can more or less be translated as, "Blessed are the Hispanics, for them to drink is to live," is often misinterpreted, and Paco Alvarez Filólogos has done a very good job at debunking some of the common misinterpretations of this joke. But for me, in this video, what I'm concerned about is how that term, Hispani, can lead us to overlook some of the important distinctions between Spanish and Portuguese, both in the Middle Ages and today. So stick around, because in today's video, we're going to be contrasting and comparing the strategies that speakers of medieval and modern Spanish employed and still do employ to adopt three important Latin consonants: vamos and vamos. As that introduction implied, there are three consonants in classical Latin that are relevant to us in this video. And those would be the labial velar approximant w, which was spelt with the letter V and is present in words like vinum and pluvium. Then we have the voiced bilabial plosive b, represented by the letter B, and present in words like brutus and ubi. Finally, the unvoiced bilabial plosive p is relevant to us. That was represented in Latin with the grapheme P, and we find it in words like princeps and lupus. Now, I've been specific here that I'm talking about classical Latin, because Latin, like every other language, changes. And once we move out of 100 years or so from the end of the Augustan age, we know that already the way that prominent speakers of Latin were pronouncing their words wasn't identical to the solid, regimentized, idealized form that we see practiced by Cicero and Virgil. In fact, all three of these consonants undergo some important subtle changes that I'd like to look at here. And the first is the way that w, that bilabial approximant, changed. That w has got two different gestures. The first is the raising of the back of the tongue towards the soft palate, and the second is the rounding of the lips. And two things seem to have happened, and if we kind of allow ourselves some rough chronological boundaries here, we can be relatively certain that this is already happening around the turn of the 2nd century AD. Those rounded lips were moving closer together in articulation of the sound, and the raising of the tongue was dropping. So from that w, we get a sound that's represented by this in IPA, and would have sounded something like w. And if there's a single symbol that we need to keep track of in this video, it's this one. It's the key to a lot of what is going to happen in Ibero-Romance. If you don't mind me jumping ahead, this voiced bilabial fricative, it would have been pronounced a lot like a modern Spanish speaker would pronounce the intervocalic B in a word like lobo. So from vinum and pluvium, in Latin of the 2nd and 3rd century AD, we would find speakers saying something like vinum and pluvium. I hope that came across well through the microphone. Then something interesting happens furthermore. That w is bilabial. The v is also bilabial. And somehow, throughout much of the Roman Empire, around the 4th century, we can surmise, this sound seems to undergo the process of labiodentalization. That is to say that it's actually pronounced more with the bottom lip against the top teeth. And this seems to be a gradual process, starting first with a sound that is symbolized by this and would have been pronounced with the bottom lip close to but not quite touching the front teeth, so something like and then culminates with a full contact between the bottom lip and the top teeth, so the modern v. If we look at the two words we've been examining so far, across the centuries we will have moved from Latin pluvium and vinum to pluvium and vinum, then to pluvium and vinum, and finally to pluvium and vinum. How do we know this happened? Well, Latinists often cite the Appendix Probi for implying some of these changes. And to get quite what they're saying, we need to move on to the changes in the second consonant we've looked at, that bilabial voiced plosive b. Historical linguists José Ignacio Ugalde, Mariana Nadeo, and Miquel Simonet state that we know by this 1st and 2nd centuries AD, the Latin b had started to merge with the Latin w, and they cite the Appendix Probi. You see, the disgruntled author of the Appendix Probi is constantly complaining that writers are placing V's where there should be B's and B's where there should be V's, which indicates a general confusion between all these different consonants. It's still confusing for us today to piece together these changes approximately 2,000 years later with all of the research that we have at our disposal. But what is important is that we understand that broadly across the empire, we're seeing some important shifts between w and b. P, however, seems to remain relatively stable. Now, let's dive straight into Old Spanish and see how these developed in the Iberian Peninsula particularly. In contrast to what we see happen in much of France and much of Italy, Old Spanish seems to remain at the bilabial voiced fricative stage of the transformation of this grapheme V in Latin. In Old Spanish, where we see a U or a V, it was almost certainly pronounced V, and medieval scribes seem to have treated U and V pretty much interchangeably. The Latin wacam is spelt like this and likely pronounced waka, wallem as walle, and versuram, where we get modern Spanish basura from, as basura. Interestingly enough, Spanish never seems to have developed that labiodental voiced v sound that we see exists in Italian and in French. So that's what happened with the Latin w in Old Spanish. The Latin b is conserved in almost all positions. Bucam gives us boca, and bonum gives us bueno. However, the Latin p does undergo some changes. While it's conserved in initial position, in words like palabra, which comes from Latin parabola, and promesa, which comes from Latin promissa, it's voiced in intervocalic context. So Latin lupus becomes lobo, and sapere becomes saber. I'd like to cite Newcastle University for the examples I've provided above. And if we can take away anything from this particular section on Old Spanish, it's that Spanish never seems to have developed the labiodental v, as I just mentioned before. Now, I say this and double down on it here because it's actually a mistake I made in a video long ago. I can't even remember which, but I stated in that video that Old Spanish had a v sound, and I was actually corrected in the comments below, and I just want to rectify that here and state that it was actually because I misinterpreted something Linguriosa said on her channel. Now, armed with what we know about how these three consonants were pronounced in Old Spanish, let's do the right thing and read El Cantar del Mio Cid, combining our reading with what we've learned in previous videos on medieval Spanish pronunciation. So I'm going to read from it here, and I'd like you to especially pay attention to the pronunciation of tornaba, cabeza, puertas, and abiertas, the opening lines of El Cantar del Mio Cid. De los ojos tan fuertemente llorando, tornaba la cabeza e estábalos catando. Vio puertas abiertas e uzzos sin cañados, alcántras vacías, sin pieles e sin mantos, e sin falcones e sin adores mudados. Now, let's track the changes from Old Spanish to modern Spanish. According to Rolf Penny, by the 1400s, the Old Spanish b, represented by b, and w, represented by v, had merged in word initial position, and this was generalized to anywhere in any word by the 1600s, and this independent of spelling. And from there, we get in standard modern Spanish the complete identity of V and B in pronunciation. They're both pronounced as the bilabial voiced plosive b. So, the famous city Valencia and the famous fashion house Balenciaga are pronounced basically exactly the same except for that ending syllable. There is one exception though, and that is when a B finds itself in intervocalic position. Now, in Old Spanish, this was pronounced as a b. We have lobo in Old Spanish. But in modern Spanish, it's been somewhat devoiced and also moved back to an approximant as opposed to a full-on plosive. It's not lobo anymore, but lobo. And so we have the return of this famous grapheme in modern Spanish. Now, to wrap up the Spanish part of this video, let's read an excerpt from my favorite poem in the modern Spanish language, Francisco de Quevedo's beautiful elegy of his own library. Pay particular attention to the pronunciation of paz, that has conserved the Latin plosive p in word initial position, libros, vivo, conversación, and abiertos, among other examples we'll find here. Retirado en la paz de estos desiertos, con pocos pero doctos libros juntos, vivo en conversación con los difuntos y con mis ojos escucho a los muertos, sino siempre entendidos, siempre abiertos, o enmiendan o fecundan mis asuntos, y en músicos callados contrapuntos al sueño de la vida hablan despiertos. Now, let's fulfill the promise made in the introduction to this video and compare the Spanish with what occurred in Portuguese. And we'll start with Galician-Portuguese. In fact, by and large, the same patterns unfold here as we see in Old Spanish. Initial Latin p and b are conserved. In Galician-Portuguese, the Latin bene has become ben, and panem has become pan. Notice that neither of these yet has the nasalized vowel ending that they have in modern Portuguese. In fact, that process is occurring already in Galician Portuguese, but it's yet to be generalized totally across the language, and in singular nouns particularly. The intervocalic p has become a b, and that's why Latin capere is Portuguese caber, cuperare is cobrar, and recipere is receber. Latin w has become v, always spelt v or u, of course. And so, in initial position, we have the Latin vadit is vai, ventum, vento. It's also evident in middle word position too. Latin lavare is Galician Portuguese lavar. But with these similarities aside, this is where Portuguese gets super interesting, because that intervocalic b, pronounced as the bilabial affricate b in Old Spanish and in modern Spanish pronounced as the v, has an uncertain history in Galician Portuguese. You see, we need to do the uncertain work of working backwards a little bit from the spelling. Where there was a Latin grapheme b intervocalically, we see the Galician Portuguese grapheme v. You see, bibere is actually spelled like this, bibere in Latin like this, and the medieval Latin caballum like so. This in and of itself does not settle the question, because we've already seen that there was widespread confusion between these graphemes already in the 4th century. But some experts assert the following, and that is that in the heartland of what is today Portugal, so first the Condado Portugalense and then later the court of the Kingdom of Portugal, this intervocalic V was pronounced as the bilabial approximate V. So from Latin debere, we get this Portuguese word which would have been pronounced deber, bibere, beber. However, that's the case in the heartland of medieval Portugal. In the south of what was eventually the Kingdom of Portugal, many scholars argue, we actually see a labiodental fricative, v. So not deber, but dever, not beber, but bever. But why? Well, I would love to know. Perhaps it's due to the influence of Arabic in the south of Portugal, or maybe due to the influence of some other linguistic force operating on that porous border between the near Atlantic and the bustling Mediterranean Sea. What is certain, however, is that in time Portuguese developed a sound that did not exist and does not exist in Spanish. But you might be raising your hand. There are exceptions in Spanish too. Famously, in Andalusia, we do see a voiced labiodental v, which makes me think that the external influence theory has something to it. Andalusia is naturally in the south of Spain, the same area that seems to have pronounced this v in Galician Portuguese. The transition, thus, from Galician Portuguese to modern Portuguese is pretty simple. It's actually a case of, as far as I understand, perfect conservation. If I'm wrong there, however, please point that out in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed that video. I enjoyed very much researching it and recording it. If you've noticed anything wrong in the video here, let me know in the comments below. But I'm looking forward to interacting with you there. And for now, I will say, até logo and hasta luego.